For some reason, it seems to take a while for the transition, so the timing might be a bit off with the slides. I've just pressed next, and it took a while to come. So in this talk, I'm going to be giving a general introduction to ZAP. Then I'm going to give an overview of automation, because that is definitely one of ZAP's strengths. And then I'm going to a bit more detail on the automation framework, and finally talk about authentication. I say talk about, I'm going to try and do demos as well, because just talking and showing slides is kind of not too interesting for you all. So I'm going to start off with a good question. What is ZAP? So I'm assuming that some people here will not know a lot about ZAP, and some people might know quite a bit. So I'm trying to get this as a good range of explanation. So ZAP is a tool for finding vulnerabilities in web applications. And we're really talking about custom applications here. So we're not talking about, you're using WordPress, you've got a particular version of a WordPress plugin which has known vulnerabilities. There are tools that will find these things for you. We're not so interested in those. We will find some of those vulnerabilities, but really we're looking for, if you like, unknown vulnerabilities in unknown applications rather than the known vulnerabilities in known applications. So these are, because if you've got an application that nobody's ever seen before, the tools that just look for known vulnerabilities will think there's nothing wrong with it, whereas in fact it could have loads of problems. So ZAP is an OWASP flagship project. So the flagship projects are the ones that are most mature and kind of recommended for most people to use as early as possible. And like all OWASP projects, it is completely free and open source. It is cross-platform, so it requires Java, Java 11, but you can run on pretty much anything that will cope with Java 11, including a Raspberry Pi. It doesn't run particularly quickly on a Raspberry Pi, but you can still do it. And it's well maintained, and I kind of make a note, I do stress this because I try and track open source web scanners. There are a lot of them have come and a lot of them have gone. So there are a lot of them out there which are no longer maintained. And I think that's it's important to use tools that are well maintained whenever possible. And one thing, finally, what is ZAP? The main thing, or something which we think is fairly significant, is that we believe it is the world's most popular web scanner. If the slides will transition for me. Finally get there. So this is a fairly significant claim. And how do we justify it? So last month, we know we had 3.8 million check for updates in a month, which is pretty significant. So we know that ZAP is used by large companies, small companies, medium companies, and individuals all over the world. It is the foundation for lots of commercial security tools. We've actually got the list that we know about on the website. Obviously, that includes JIT, who sponsor my work, but there's a lot of other companies who use ZAP under the hood, whether they admit to it or not. And let's see if they, yeah, I'm definitely having problems with the transitions here. You can do it. Apparently it doesn't want to. And it seems to have completely frozen, which is somewhat frustrating. Ah, there you go. So finally, after several minutes, we do have a link with all the statistics. And what I will do now is I will just switch over to Firefox. So we've got the ZAproxy.org website, and if you go to documentation, you will scroll down, we'll see statistics. So there's a whole load of statistics, including bar charts where you can see the check for updates per month, direct downloads, and all these wonderful things. So there's a lot of stuff there, and justification why ZAP is, we're claiming ZAP is the world's most popular web scanner. And I'm now not sure this is going to work very well. I may have to abandon these slides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually carry on talking through the slides because they appear for me. Actually, what I can do is sorry about this. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to put the slides on here, so it's not going to look particularly good, but at least you will be able to see what I'm talking about. So who is ZAP for? So ZAP is for developers and functional testers, kind of initially. When I first released ZAP, I was a developer and I really was looking for a tool, a security tool that I could use and that could find vulnerabilities in the applications that I was developing. And so that's really where I started. And when I released ZAP, it was very much that's what I was looking for, and that's what I was aiming ZAP at. And just that, see if it's any better. But we do know, I mean, ZAP is used by students a lot. So one of the advantages of ZAP is because it's completely open source, you can see exactly what it does. You can see how it works and you can get involved in as well. And we actually do have a Student Hall of Fame. So go to the community section of ZAP and you'll see somewhere down here, we have a Student Hall of Fame. So these are all the students who have made major contributions to ZAP, including some very significant features. And that's all available on the website. But we do know that as well as developers, functional testers, and students, security professionals probably make up the bulk of people who are using ZAP, at least manually in any way. So we know that we're dealing with people who, right from people who have very little security experience, right up to hardcore pen testers, which is can be a challenging range of people to keep happy. That's what we try and do. So ZAP is, we try and release ZAP. We're trying to average around twice a year, and we're kind of getting there. I think last year was some November time, and we've got another release coming, hopefully very soon. ZAP has a plugin architecture, and a lot of the functionality is now in add-ons. And we like add-ons because we can release them as and when required. We can release new add-ons, or we can update add-ons, as we've just updated about half a dozen add-ons this morning, I think. So add-ons, they might sound like they're additional, but they have actually core features. So things like the traditional spider and the Ajax spider in add-ons, the automation framework, the new authentication helper, all these things are implemented as add-ons. We're trying to move as much functionality from the core into add-ons as we can, partly because we can update them much more quickly. So we also have weekly releases, which haven't actually done this week. So it's usually done on a Monday. I was off yesterday, so it hasn't been done, but probably later today or early tomorrow, this week's release will go out. And we also have a daily Docker image as well. So you have various options for using ZAP. ZAP has a desktop GUI, which I will be showing you later. You can actually use this in Docker. There's a product called WebSwing, and they've very kindly allowed us to use ZAP, well, include that in our Docker images. And that actually gives you a web interface on top of Swing, which is very impressive, actually works surprisingly well. So you don't have to have Java installed locally, but if you do, you can have the desktop GUI running. We have a heads-up display, which is quite innovative. Unfortunately, it's not currently maintained. We're hoping to get some more people to work on that. But that is very, very different, but probably don't have time to demo that today. And then automation. And we do believe that ZAP is used more in automation than in any other way. So automation is a very significant use case for ZAP. So when should you use ZAP? Definitely, I would recommend not just before releasing an application onto the web. What we say is you can you can use ZAP manually while you're testing your application's UI. And I think there's a really effective way, particularly for developers and functional testers. You can put ZAP in attack mode, so you can just test your application manually via the browser, proxying through ZAP, and ZAP will then find a whole load of vulnerabilities and let you know what things you're doing wrong very early on the development lifecycle. So we can, obviously, the way a lot of people automate ZAP is with full scans, where we're exploring the application using one or more of the spiders, potentially proxying a regression test through, or importing API definitions, and then attacking them with a full scan. And that is that can take a while. It all depends on the application and the box you've got to test it with. So, you know, it's not something you can do and you typically want to do in pull requests, but you can do limited scans much more quickly. So you could focus on just cross-site scripting, just specific types of vulnerabilities, or if you can actually tell when pull requests have a limited impact on the endpoints, if you know which endpoints are affected, then you can just scan those. So ZAP is very flexible in what it can handle. It's got an insane amount of configuration. So one thing it doesn't understand, of course, is source code, because we're not a static analyzer. But if you understand source code, you've got something that does understand source code, can convert between code changes and changes to endpoints, then you can just limit ZAP to attack those. So that was the quick introduction to ZAP. Has anyone got any questions so far?
There's a quick question just on what exactly was a heads-up display. Better was just like a very quick overview of that.
Sure. So I haven't tested this for a while, and I know there are problems. So what I'm going to do is this is ZAP. This is the ZAP desktop GUI, and we'll go into manual option, and I suspect this won't work because we have had some problems, and I'm running Zoom now, and I think there's timing issues here, but let's give it a go because I like living dangerously. And yes, right, so it did actually work. So what we have here is I've launched Firefox from ZAP, and we're trying to make it obvious when you've got the HUD going. So you get this big splash screen, which you can decide not to have. For those of you who don't know, all these controls here on the left-hand side and the right-hand side are not part of Budget. So these have been added by ZAP. And so when we actually navigate around the application, you will start to see things change, and you should see some. So there you go. So ZAP has found absence of cross-site request forgery token. What you can see is information, interesting, useful information about the page. So I can go there, and when it goes one. So you can see things like the page alerts, and you can click on any of these and get more information. You can also see the history and things like that. So the idea is that we're actually decorating the browser with information from ZAP. And what the idea is here is that this allows you to actually focus on the application you're testing rather than your security tool. So we're bringing information from ZAP into the browser, so you can see things, and you can delve into them if you want, or you can then go into more detail in ZAP itself. Is that a good quick introduction to the HUD?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yep.
Okay, so so what I was going to do now is go back to my is to talk about the different ways to automate ZAP. So we know that the majority of times ZAP is run from our stats, that it is automation. ZAP is a tool that is particularly well suited for automation. We have an option for, but there's a whole range of different ways you can actually automate ZAP. And they work better or worse in particular ways, particular times. So we've got a quick start command line option, which I'm not going to dwell on because it's very limited and not particularly useful. So it's something that might go away at some point, although we're not particularly good at getting rid of options because we know that there's always someone somewhere who relies on something. Then we've got the Docker package scans. And what I'll do is switch over to the browser and move the Zoom window out of my way. So if you have a look at the ZAP documentation, we've got this automate option and the Docker package scans. So we've got a Docker's user guide, which explains how the different Docker images we've got and things about them. And then we have these three: the baseline scan, the full scan, and the API scan. So these they're actually Python scripts, and they've got a set of what we think are common options. So you start Docker with the baseline, and the mandatory option is the target. So like that. So you can just specify URL, and ZAP will then go and attack it. Now, there are quite a few options, those not as many as ZAP supports. And we do have, so that will be a simple way of how we can run ZAP, the baseline scan. And the idea is ZAP will spider the application by default for 1 minute, by default using the traditional spider, and will just do passive scanning. And as this was asked earlier, passive scanning is where ZAP looks but doesn't touch. So it just looks at the requests and responses, and based on that, it can find a set of things that are wrong with your application. It could be missing security headers, it could be missing flags on certain cookies. There's a whole range of things it can find, and ZAP will report those things to you. So this is something that should finish within a couple of minutes, so this can be used in CI/CD if you want. We also actually allow you to specify a configuration file, so you can actually say what level you want each individual scan rule to have. So you can change the warnings to failures or to ignore. And this is not the full set. This is just probably a default set from a while ago. But you can tune it to report any of the, to ignore any particular vulnerabilities you like. And there are options for putting things out of scope as well. And you can actually specify a file where you specify known vulnerabilities. And you can specify pretty much any ZAP configuration item that you like. So the baseline scan doesn't do any actually attacking. We do have a full scan, and that is where similar, but it's not I don't think it limits to 1 minute by default. The spider and the active scan will take significantly longer. Yeah, so the spider with a full scan defaults to no limit. You can specify a limit, but then the full scan will typically take a significant amount of time, but will do all the full attacking, and will do has the same options for the configuration file and progress file and things. Then we have the API scan, and that is kind of similar to the full scan, but this time you have to specify an API definition. So it supports OpenAPI, SOAP, or GraphQL. Otherwise, it's kind of similar. So those are the package scans, and we have some GitHub actions as well, and we actually have GitHub actions for the same things. So if we go back to the ZAP documentation, you see GitHub actions, and we have a look at that in a new tab. Then you'll see on the GitHub marketplace, you have the baseline scan, the API scan, the full scan. So very similar. They've got pretty similar functionality. We might not expose all of the options, but there's quite a few there. So you can run the baseline in your own environment, or you can use GitHub actions. Then there's the automation framework, which I'm going to go into more detail, so I won't explain that anymore right now. There's also the API and daemon mode. So ZAP has a very powerful API. And I will switch to the ZAP desktop now. So although it's got a desktop, it has this API. So let's go and make sure I can actually get to the URL. If you point your browser at ZAP, the host and port that ZAP is listing on, then you'll see these links and you actually have a link to the local API, which I will now make a bit bigger. And what ZAP has is ZAP has a component architecture. Many of these actually relate directly to add-ons. And you'll be able to see that if you go into any particular one of these, you'll see a whole set of what we call views, and these are things which return information, actions which actually do something, and others which we don't have any of there. But if I go into the core, we'll see there's a whole set of other actions, which could be things like returning a report, or basically exporting it and outputting anything which is not HTML format. That's pretty much the definition. And you can actually play around with these things here. So if you actually want to get a alert summary, we can actually see, that's because I started a brand new session, didn't I? And so there are no alerts. But you can basically get, you can run any of these commands from the API UI. So you can play around and try them out. And this works exactly the same if ZAP is running in desktop mode or in daemon mode. Obviously, with daemon mode, you don't get the UI, so you can't see what's going on. So any questions about the automation options with the exception of...
No, I think we were given that.
We have a few questions.
Right.
There's Simon, is it a passive attack or do we have control over it? That Nizar asked.
Sorry, what was that?
Does that do a passive attack or do we have control over it?
So ZAP will, let me just, I will launch the browser, the Firefox without the HUD this time. So just see, so this is what Budget Store looks like. And what I'll do now is if I go back to ZAP, you'll see we actually have some alerts down here. So go to the alerts tab, we will see a set of information. So this is telling us it has found a form which does not have an anti-CSRF token. So this is, so what ZAP is doing is it's passively scanning all the requests and responses. You don't have to tell ZAP to do that because this is not damaging. It's just looking at things. So it's completely safe and you don't have to worry about it. So passive scanning is on by default. ZAP will not attack anything unless you tell it to. So, you know, we're very aware that people are, you know, only want to attack things, only legally allowed to attack things that you have permission to attack. So you have to tell ZAP to attack at something in order to do it.
And another question is from Better again, is how does ZAP spidering compare to spidering in Burp Suite?
That I don't know. So we have two spiders. We have the traditional spider, which is a standard crawler, so it looks for HTML and looks for URLs and follows those and submits forms. This is fast and furious, but it doesn't handle modern web apps well. And by modern web apps, I mean applications that have a lot of JavaScript. So for that, we have the Ajax spider, and the Ajax spider launches browsers, and you can choose any modern browser, i.e. Firefox or Chrome. And we support other ones, but they are the best ones for automating. And that launches browsers and clicks on things. We actually use another open source project called Crawljax. I cannot tell you, don't have a Burp Pro license, so I can't tell you how it compares. But I do know that the Ajax spider was released well before pretty much any other commercial tool supported anything like this.
And we have another question from Istvan, who's asking, is there a straightforward way to debug or develop custom JavaScript authentication scripts?
Right. Straightforward way, no, because it's hard. I will leave that one till later because I'm going to talk more about authentication then.
That's it for now.
Okay, great. So what I was going to do now is talk about the automation framework. So the idea of the automation framework is you can control ZAP with one YAML file. Now, we have the package scans, but we found that they are still quite limited for some people. People keep on coming up with options they want to support, and there's a limit to how many command line options you can add. I mean, okay, there isn't really, but the number of useful ones, it gets very difficult to manage. So the idea is this is actually more flexible than the package scans. And we're actually migrating the package scans to use the automation framework under the hood. So if you use the baseline scan with default options, you will actually be using the automation framework. It doesn't support everything that the package scans need yet, but it's getting close. So at some point, when you run a package scan, you will be using the automation framework, no matter what you do. The other thing is the package scans are restricted to Docker. They don't have to be. They're actually using the ZAP API under the hood, but it's just for historical reasons they're tied to Docker. And ZAP isn't tied to Docker, and the automation framework isn't either. So you don't have to use Docker. You can use Docker, it works well, but you don't have to. But there's also a GUI option for the automation framework as well. So, and that is something I can demo because just running a YAML file from the command line is not particularly easy or particularly good to demo. So we have a tab here for the automation framework. And what you can do is you can create a new plan. What I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to add budget to a context. So the idea of context in ZAP is quite important because contexts are, I mean, they could be one application, they could be part of an application, there could be multiple applications, but what they are is, well, essentially they're a set of URL regexes. So they're a set of include and exclude regexes, but logically they are something you want to associate things with. And we can change the structure, the technology, authentication, which I'll go into later. But basically, if you want to configure something specific to do with an application, you really need to be in a context. And the automation framework actually works on contexts. So if I create a new plan, then I'm going to choose budget. And we have a set of profiles. So I will choose the baseline profile, and that selects a set of jobs for me. And I will unselect this Ajax spider because it doesn't actually help. And it'll just take a bit of time. But what I'll do now is I can run that plan from within the ZAP GUI. And you'll see you see the progress down here. You can see that we configured the passive scan, we ran the spider, and we waited for the passive scan to finish, and we generated a report. And there is the report. Hopefully, if I, not that one. If I get the right browser window. Great. Sorry about this. Then you see the ZAP scanning report. So what you can see is the automation framework is based on a set of jobs. And there are quite a few jobs. And what we can do is go back to the ZAP website. And if you have a look at this under documentation, automation, the automation framework, and we actually have all of the jobs here. And if you go and have a look at any of them, you'll see that we've got all of the YAML as well. So we've got lots of information, and you can create the files manually by hand if you want, or you can actually create them via the desktop GUI. And if you do that, there are some advantages, particularly when it comes to configuring things. So, and what you'll see is you get a certain amount of output. So this is the same output you'd get from the command line as well. But there are some other interesting features. And one of them is what we call job tests. Because one thing that always worries me with automation is that how do you know it did what you thought it did? And I had this, is something that really concerned me at Mozilla, because I set up ZAP to do some authenticated scans. It's like, well, what if the authentication fails? And this did actually happen to me one time. I got the ZAP, it's actually scanning addons.mozilla.org. And one day I got an alert saying it's all gone horribly wrong. And it had gone wrong because the team had actually changed the way they authenticate. So it was fairly fundamental. But I got an alert for that because that was something I was worried about. And that came. So that was something I put an extra check-in for in my configuration. And with automation, this is very much a concern for us. So we have these things called tests. And so I should have said, if you double click on any of these items in the plan, you get a dialog. And what this one is, this is a statistics test. So ZAP maintains a large number of statistics. If I go back to the website and go back to the documentation and scroll down, you'll see internal statistics. So these are all of the statistics that ZAP maintains. And what you can do is you can now put tests on these as in the automation framework. And by default, ZAP will add, when you add the spider job, it will check the number of URLs. And in this case, we just put 100 in. If you've only got 50 URLs to find, it'll fail. That doesn't matter. You can go and change this. So what you can do is you can actually check anything that ZAP does. And if there's anything that you can't find out and you think you need to, let us know and we will put those things in. And this is particularly important for authentication, as I'll explain in a bit when I get to there. So that is a very quick overview of the automation framework. As I said, from here, you can actually generate the YAML files. So you can save those, you can run them from the command line. And yeah, it is, you can't configure absolutely everything from ZAP in the automation file, in the automation framework plan, but we've put in everything that we think is you're likely to need for automation. So if there's something you need that isn't in there, then let us know. Any questions about the automation framework?
There are a couple of questions. Let's have a look. Is there a built-in issue tracker integration for the results? So, for example, GitHub, Jira, etc.
Right, so we do have something. So if you go to the ZAP website and then go to the marketplace, then these are all of the add-ons that are available. Some of them are actually included in with ZAP by default. And we do have a bug tracker. So looks like it supports Bugzilla and GitHub at the moment. It says etc. So I'm not, I have to check what that supports, but that is the one that I'm aware of. There may be, I can't think of any other.
And also, based on what you've shown, can you view all the requests and responses made by automation from ZAP, not just the stats?
Right, so ZAP, I mean, the whole idea with automation is there's probably not someone actually looking at things. So the requests that the automation framework made are not shown by the desktop in the history. However, all of those things are actually still there. So they are, so let me just go to the ZAP GUI and hopefully see. Yeah, so we can see the alerts there, and let's go and have a look at the, do we have it? Or messages. So I'll just do the first 10 messages. So there you go. So we can see, so all of the, everything is available via the API. So that's the first 10 messages. And they'll be up. So everything that ZAP does goes into a database, SQLite, HQLSDB database, and all of that is accessible via the ZAP API. And one thing I should point out is that if we go back to the automation framework documentation, so automation framework, one thing you'll see is that we have support for scripts. So we can add, remove, and run scripts within ZAP. And ZAP scripting is incredibly powerful. I'll just quickly show you the ZAP scripting list. So these are the different types of scripts that ZAP supports. And so we can integrate ZAP scripts at loads of different places within ZAP. It effectively means you can reprogram ZAP on the fly pretty much. And we've got loads of example scripts. We've got a community scripts repo with loads of examples there. So I think ZAP scripting is one of the real strengths, and you can actually edit and run the scripts in ZAP as well. So we've got a script console, and you can then write and run the scripts from within here.
Okay, a couple more questions. Can you upload additions to the marketplace outside of ZAP proxy add-ons repository?
So, I mean, we don't let arbitrary people upload add-ons. That would be somewhat dangerous. But we have third-party add-ons on there. So if you want to publish something to the ZAP marketplace, then just get in touch.
Okay. And then can a complex authentication be recorded as a ZEST script? In other words, is the proxy configuration passed to the automation?
Right.
Oh no, sorry, wrong. Two questions, versions one, and manipulate for reusing it for passive active scans periodically, for example.
Right. So we have this was the ZEST script and authentication, right?
Yep.
Okay, so what we can do is we can record sequences. There is a little button here for recording a ZEST script, and you can record different types of ZEST scripts. At the moment, we can only record server-side ones. So server-side ones are the requests and responses. So we can do that. And one of the things we do have is we have support for sequences as well. So if there are particular sequences you need to run, and we can record those, and then ZAP will attack those and will know to run each step of the sequence. We'll run the first step, attack that, run the first step, then the second step and attack that, first step, second step, third step, etc. So it will do that. This was a student project implemented a little while ago, so I haven't tried that one for a while, but so we can record the requests and responses. But we've actually now got a Google Summer of Code student working on recording browser-side requests as well. So the plan is these will be recorded as ZEST client-side scripts, and they will then you'll be able to record those from a browser add-on without ZAP involved at all, or you'll be able to record them in ZAP browsers launched from ZAP, and you'll be able to use those as authentication sequences or whatever you like.
Okay, Istvan is asking, can you set up another proxy to view the request response? In other words, is the proxy configuration passed to the automation?
So, I mean, the automation is just a way of running ZAP. So if you do something in the GUI or via automation, it ends up in the same code. So if we have a look at the network, we have supports for HTTP proxies, SOCKS proxies, so you can have upstream proxies, and the automation obeys all of these things. So if you configure, once you get into the ZAP internals, it doesn't care whether you're using the GUI, the HUD, automation framework, the API. ZAP just works in the same way. Those are just ways of driving ZAP. Everything works in the same way once you get inside.
And Glebs is also asking, you might have answered already, but what programming languages are available for scripting?
I will probably forget some of them. So I will go to the marketplace, and hopefully if I put script in there, I'll get some others. But okay, Kotlin, Python, Ruby, Zest, and we got JavaScript built in as well. So those are, that's the setup from what I remember.
And this Dan is asking, since you've touched upon the script console, do you have code completion and debug support there? If not, where could the documentation for the interfaces be found?
Oh, right. So we do have limited code completion. What this means is if you, let's see if I can, let's live dangerously. I will create a for so what I can do is, if you have a look here, so this is an active scan rule, and there are various options like scanning a node, scanning a message, but you'll see there are some parameters here. So what I'll do is, if I just go in here and type that parameter and then a dot, then you'll see we get code completion. And if we select one of these things and keep pressing dots, you will get the next thing. So we've got code completion like that. If, however, I go off, type something else, go back, then you don't get it. So you basically, it's a kind of cheap code completion where if you type in one of these recognized variable names, then it will actually, you do get code completion as long as you keep going. If I do something like and then type it, we don't get code completion. There's no real understanding of source code here. All it is it's recognizing I typed MSG and that's a parameter. So then it goes and works out what other options you can do. So yes, there is code completion. Documentation, we've got Java docs. So the scripts are very much wrappers around Java. So you will see that there are quite a lot of there is documentation in the actual templates. But if you go to the community scripts, there's more documentation there, loads of examples, but otherwise you end up having to go to the Java docs.
Better is also asking, is there a short list of ZAP commands out there that you would recommend?
Short list. We've got a long list. We do, I mean, we do have for the GUI, then there is there's something to do with keys, I'm sure. You can actually, there's keyboard shortcuts and you can generate key cheat sheets. But really for commands, I mean, you're either using the desktop GUI or you're using the automation framework. So I'm not sure what the shortlist is, and I'm not sure. It all depends on what you're trying to do, really. If anyone produces one for particular use cases, then that'd be great. But yeah, I don't have any available, I'm afraid.
Okay, thanks, Simon.
Okay, so that was the automation framework, and what I was going to do now is tell you a little bit about authentication. So basically, ZAP can, in theory, handle any authentication you throw at it. But the problem until recently is you had to know exactly how to configure it. So if we go and have a look at the context, so context, as I said, a key, particularly if you want to associate things with ZAP. And in this case, authentication is something to associate. So we have a option for a screen for authentication, and we've got a set of different authentication options. So manual authentication means it's down to you. So it's all up to you. One thing you will see is the authentication verification, and that applies no matter what. So authentication is the actually making one or more requests that takes you from not being authenticated to being authenticated. But then how do we know that we still are authenticated? And for that, we we have what we call authentication verification. And we have a couple of strategies, checking the requests, responses, or polling a specific URL. And the checking every response or every request and response tends to work better for traditional web applications. So something like Budget will be fine because that has either the link to the user or a login button on every page. So you can check for these things. If you see the login button, then you know you're not authenticated. But for a more modern web application, which is using a lot of JavaScript and making API calls to APIs, then we've got the option for polling a specified URL. So you can specify a URL, and in all cases, you give regex patterns to identify logged in messages, logged out messages. You can specify host data, additional headers, all these lovely things. How you identify a suitable URL can be tricky, particularly if you haven't got involved in the authentication or session handling for the application. Say if you're a security person for a lot of development teams, or if you're a developer and you've used a third-party authentication mechanism, which wouldn't be too surprising these days. So one of the problems here is you have to tell Zap exactly what to do. So you'll see that we support form-based authentication, HTTP, NTM, but in all these cases, you've got to give us information, JSON-based and script-based. And script-based, really, you have to do everything. It's incredibly flexible, but you have to program the lot. We also have session management. So we need to know, or Zap needs to know, whether it's HTTP authentication, script-based, header-based, cookie-based. So you have to go in and configure all these things. If you do that, then it'll work, unless you get it wrong. So this is something that we know Zap is very powerful, but we've found that it is, people struggle with it. And what I've found is that in general, there are a set of things that, whenever I have to configure Zap to handle a new application, there's a standard set of things I had to go through to do that. So we now have a new option, and you might have noticed that we have the option here to auto-detect session management. And if I go to authentication, there's an option to auto-detect that. And with verification, there's auto-detect as well. So the idea of this is Zap will automatically detect common authentication, session handling, and verification. The authentication handling is kind of interesting, but it's not so useful in my opinion, because I think the more useful one is browser-based authentication. And this is where you basically just specify the URL, and you will need to specify user credentials as well. And what we've got now is we have a new option. So if I go to the tools, you'll see we have an authentication tester. And one of the things is, so the idea is this will actually test authentication, and it will basically tell you how far it's got, and will actually configure a context for you. Now, one thing is, how do we actually know that the authentication is working or not? And this is a bit of a problem, particularly as there aren't very many good examples online. So what we've done is created a new set of examples. Hope I've got the URL right. No, it's not. Oh, is it 1991? I think I'll go 1991. Hey, so we have a new add-on, which is it's a development add-on. And what this does is actually has a load of different types of authentication. They're quite simple pages, but it gives you the credentials. So you can see it's test@test.com and password 123. And then it says you're logged in. Great. And what we can do is, if we actually have a look at the alerts now, you should see that we have actually identified an authentication request, and you can see there from some of the evidence for it. And we give you information like the user parameter, the user value, the password parameter, though not the password in this particular case for security reasons. And you'll see we actually identified session management response. We can see the access token there. And you won't see a verification URL being detected because that only happens when you actually try it out. So what you can do is you can configure an application, configure ZAP to say that it should try and handle everything itself. So what I'm going to do is just probably you took the URL right, so just go and pick one of these at random. So what you can do now is with the authentication tester dialog, you can basically put your URL in, put in the username, and you can then test it. And what it'll do, it will launch a browser, and by default, this is one you can actually see. And you actually see it taking a little while to do it. And the reason that it took a little while is because I actually put it in demo mode. So without that, it doesn't do any pausing. With it, it will actually, so I put this in so I could demo it, and you can actually see what's going on. And so in this case, you can see we identified the username field, the password field, the session handling, and the verification. So what we'll now see is you can see as a new context authentication test. And if we have a look at the authentication that is set up to be browser-based authentication, we'll see we are polling a URL, and it has found the suitable URL. It's put in a pattern, so we're looking for 200 OK. We're looking for 403 forbidden for logged out, and it's not no other headers necessary. It has added the user and the session management. It's set to be header-based session management, and it's got a bearer access token, and that is extracted from the JSON that's returned from the authentication request. So basically what that will do is we can now very quickly test to see whether ZAP can handle a login page and do all of the authentication and session handling and verification for you. Now, right now the session handling doesn't handle just cookies, so focused on things like the authorization header, but the plan is for that to come as well. But this is something which we think made it significantly easier. And the automation framework, you can just put auto detect for everything. And well, I would recommend putting browser-based authentication for the authentication, because then you can put the URL and the username and password in, the credentials. But if you set everything else to auto detect, then for a lot of websites, ZAP will be able to handle all of this for you. So that was a very quick introduction to the new authentication testing option and auto detection of authentication.
Yeah, a couple of questions, Simon, that
Sure.
popped up. Can you automate? So Marcia asks, can you automate authentication with password lists?
So, I mean, for that, presumably you are trying to brute force them. That is something, yeah, that's something that you certainly can do. We got, you can fuzz things, and we got password lists built in. It's not something we typically automate. Presumably you could do, but that's something that I kind of see as a manual option, really.
Istvan asks, could you please sum up how the forced user mode is working?
Well, so the forced user mode is something that I think is less relevant now. I definitely think so the things like browser-based authentication is going to be much more effective. Forced user mode is when For example, you identify a particular session token, then you can force ZAP to actually use that particular token, which is useful for manual testing, but I don't think it's so effective when automating. So it's not something we'll get rid of, but for automation, I definitely think the auto detection and browser-based authentication is much more effective.
Yeah. Isfan also asked, what's the strategy for session management with custom authentication? In certain cases, I've seen ZAP re-authenticating multiple times.
ZAP will probably re-authenticate. It's so, but I don't think that is a problem personally. So as long as it's not continually re-authenticating. One of the reasons ZAP will authenticate is particularly if you've got a modern web application, then one of the problems you'll find is with authentication is how do you get the session token into the browser? I have been able to get the session token into the browser for specific applications, but it's typically very application specific. So in some case, one of the things you'll see the types of scripts, we do have Selenium scripts, and what they do is they will, they run when the browser is launched. So if we're using the Ajax spider, that will launch browsers, and then if you configure the Selenium script, then that will run. So you may then be able to inject a session token into local storage or session storage, for example, but it's very application specific. The much more effective way is to actually use browser-based authentication, and we've got an option to enable that for Selenium. And then when the browser is launched, ZAP will log in using the browser-based auth, carry on. And Selenium is likely to launch browsers every so often as it needs, in which case you will see more sessions being created.
And Isfan also asks, do you still have a native Java client API besides the one that communicates through the REST API? In certain cases, I've seen it seem to offer more flexibility.
Yeah, I mean we have a Java, Python. I think we've got a Node. Yeah, so we've got the Node.js client. I've got the Java one. There are other, and Python. There are other ones as well. I can't remember which ones are better maintained, but we have a set of API clients. Yes.
That's really, the floor is open to any more questions, I guess. Oh. And we have one from Isfan. What are the different ways of telling ZAP which parameters to fuzz in an automation context?
So, I mean, be careful here. We separate attacking from fuzzing. So active scanning for us is something where ZAP is in control and attacks what it knows about. Fuzzing is a manual process where you decide what to attack. So if we have just a quick look at something, say have a look at this, just to pick a random request, and you actually want to try fuzzing that part of the referrer, you can select that, and then you have the option to actually attack it, and you choose what the payloads are, you choose how to manipulate them. This is very much a manual thing. If you're talking about the active scanner, then we have what we call input vectors. So these are the things that ZAP knows how to attack. And what you'll see is we've got standard things like URL, parameters, post parameters, URL paths, and headers, which we don't turn on by default. But we've got built-in ones for a whole load of things. But we also have input vector scripts. So you can actually go and define your own input vectors. So if you've got a custom application and ZAP, maybe it's custom encoding or something, or some particular format that ZAP doesn't recognize, you can write a script which will allow ZAP to understand whatever it wants, and you can attack anything you like.
And we have Bruce has asked, Scroll up the screen. As it's working as a proxy to intercept the conversation, will this work as a man in the middle proxy for the HTTPS stream? And so
Yes.
will it present its own copy of the server's cert to the client browser? Must trust ZAP's locally signed route. Is this correct?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on exactly what you're doing. But if you're, I mean, something like browser, let's go to Google. And you will see, yep, I've got through to Google and it's HTTPS. So, and we will see in the history, yeah, loads of requests from Google. So what happens here is, yes, ZAP does have its own root CA certificate. If you launch a browser from ZAP, we tell the browser to ignore certificate errors. So it's nice and easy. You can launch Firefox, Chrome, Safari. So you can launch these things and it'll all work fine with you without you having to worry about it. If you want to use, if you don't want to launch a browser from ZAP for whatever reason, then you can export the ZAP root CA. So that is in the dynamic SSL certificate. No, it's not. It's in the new screen now. So under network server certificates, so we can see the root CA certificate. You can actually change the validity and you can export that. And you can actually import ones if you've got a valid CA certificate. And you can then import that into your browser. So if your client does actually check HTTPS, then you will need to import the ZAP root CA as a trusted root CA certificate. But if you're launching browsers from ZAP, then you don't have to worry. ZAP handles it for you.
And Istvan made a comment, what I meant is something that's in case when you have a web application that communicates through complex data structures and only a couple of parameters would make sense to be attacked or fuzzed for that matter.
Well, yeah, I mean, basically you could turn off, I mean, if it's a complex data structure, then ZAP wouldn't understand its structure. So if you created an input vector which understood the structure, then you would be able to attack that. But said, if you go in here, you can configure any of you can turn off whatever input vectors you like. So you can turn everything off apart from script input vectors and just have particular things running if you want. So ZAP is very flexible in that regard. If it's not flexible enough for you, let us know. But no one's complained about the configuration options in this regard for a long time, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. I think that's all the questions for now, and I think we're over time. So thank you very much for input. If any final questions or comments before we conclude? If not, I would like to thank Simon very much, and thank you everyone for attending. And in the fullness of time, I will put the recording via the chapter OWASP website. And thank you everyone for coming, and have a good evening. Thank you again, Simon.
Thank you all very much. See you.
Thank you.